We have now reached the great beginning of the true cycle of complaints that will plague us, sometimes quite literally, throughout the rest of Bamidbar. We are now in Parashat. Everyone loves to pronounce that one. Beha'alotcha, exactly. And we are going to look at a section of Beha'alotcha that perhaps you haven't considered in as much detail before. We'll see how we do with it. But before we get there, we need to do a little bit of background, of history, of seeing how we feel about things. Does Judaism believe in forced conversion? Conversion at the end of a sword?
No.
Never?
Not now.
Now the rabbi has that look on his face.
What about the forced circumcision of Shechem? Would that be a...
Well, the forced circumcision of Shechem wasn't actually intended to convert them, it was intended to weaken them before the slaughter. So that was not necessarily a conversion, nor is it held up as being the normative action. It certainly is condemned by our tradition. How about the descendants of the Hashmoneans? Remember that time period that no one ever likes to talk about? Because after the Hashmoneans, the Maccabees won, they became pretty terrible kings. When they invaded surrounding countries, they did have a policy of forced conversion, or at least it seems from the historical records as being forced conversions. And in fact, Herod, often called the Great, simply because he liked to build things, was one of the descendants of one of the countries that had been forcibly converted. And our tradition says this is what happens. You know, you end up with a guy like Herod when you go around forcing people to be Jewish. Herod is not really all that wonderful, and we would much rather he had not been a member of our ranks if we could pick and choose. Okay, so we don't really believe and we don't support forcible conversion. Even when we convert an infant, a child that's been adopted, for example, or a child born to a non-Jewish mother that is going to be raised Jewishly, we still technically give that child the opportunity to refuse the privilege that we have given them of the conversion when they turn the age of mitzvah, when they become a bar bat mitzvah. After that point, they don't get to rescind it later. They get a one-time only offer. So even with a child, we were a little reluctant to make it a permanent forced conversion. Do we ever ask anyone to convert? Do we proselytize?
There's been some discussion about that. Which form do you think is?
Well, I guess it kind of depends on what you mean by proselytization, doesn't it? Most of the time when we think of proselytizing and we think of advertising a religion, we think of the model of going door to door and knocking. Of, you know, have you heard the good news, and handing out pamphlets and leaflets on street corners, of telling people that they need to be saved or somehow changed and that we have the way to do that. Judaism in the whole has not made a really big push in that direction. Why not?
We got in trouble in the Middle Ages if we tried to.
So one answer is very practical, which is pretty much no matter where Jews have lived for most of the last 1,000, if not more, years, if we tried to encourage conversion, or indeed in many instances, even if we permitted conversion, we would get in deep, deep trouble with the local authorities. Neither the Christian nor the Muslim authorities were terribly happy if people became Jewish on their watch.
My grandmother used to say, a man convinced against his will is of the same opinion still.
An interesting phrase. So practically we didn't, but now of course those barriers are gone, and prior to those barriers we have history. Did we promote? Did we encourage conversion? Do we encourage conversion? Should we encourage conversion? Why don't we keep that in mind as we take a look at what might be seen, depending upon how we're going to read it, one example of potential convincing, of encouragement of a conversion. So we are going to be taking a look at chapter 10, verse 11 of the book of Numbers in Bamidbar. You'll find that as the very last sentence on page 823. But it's chapter 10, verse 11 for those playing at home. We all find it? Okay. Anyone want to volunteer to take us through the English?
You're on 10?
11. In the second year.
In the second year, on the 20th day of the second month, the cloud lifted from the tabernacle of the pact, and the Israelites set out on their journeys from the wilderness of Sinai.
Okay. What's this?
The cloud came to rest in the wilderness of Paran.
What's happening?
The camp of the Israelites is getting ready to move from
Finally!
one camp to another. Yeah.
Finally! We have been at Mount Sinai since the giving of Torah. Since we left Egypt. We left Egypt 50 days later, celebrating Shavuot. We got the Torah. We've been sitting there until now, the second month of the second year. That's a long time to be camped in one place, especially because where did we think we were going?
Israel.
To Israel. So where are we headed now?
Israel.
Israel. We should all be elated. We get to go to Israel finally, right? I know we've read the book. we know how it turns out, but we saw the movie. But it's important to remember because both in many movies as well as many of our own slightly incorrect recollections, we might be of the opinion that there should be no excitement now because we know there's still another 38 years. But in fact, that's not true yet. We are still, at this moment, on course for entering Israel immediately. We have not been told we're not going to, because we haven't done anything yet that would prevent us from entering the land of Israel immediately. What are we eventually going to do? That will make God say, 40 years, guys, cool it.
The report of the spies.
The report of the spies and the acceptance of that report by the entire community. So we haven't had that report yet. We haven't had that report yet. At the moment, we're just getting ready to go, and as far as we know, it's only a matter of days until we're in Israel. Got the stage set? Okay, keep on.
When the march was to begin, at the Lord's command through Moses, the first camp to set out, troop by troop, was the division of Judah. In command of its troops was Nahshon, son of Amminadab. In command of the tribal troop of Eshar, Nathaniel, son of Zuar, and in command of the tribal troop of Zebulun, Eli, son of Elah.
Okay, I'm not going to make you go through all the names, but I wanted to get the taste of what we're about to do, which is we're breaking camp. And as we're breaking camp, each of the tribes are gathering their things together, and they're moving behind their standard, behind their degel, their flag. And they are now on the march. So I just wanted to make sure we had a feel for the magnitude of getting all of these people together to now march forward. Got that?
Cecil B. DeMille gets in line.
What's that?
Cecil B. DeMille gets in line.
Yeah, well, actually, Sister B. DeMille tends to get a lot of things a little bit wrong. But we don't want to criticize him. He made a great spectacle that seemed to move a lot of people, and he did say it was a movie rather than a documentary. So we'll let that slide. But let's go ahead then and pick up to where the story continues, which is going to be on verse 28. Please.
Such was the order of march of the Israelites as they marched troop by troop.
Nice and orderly.
Moses said to Joab, son of Ruel, the midnight, Moses' father-in-law.
Wait, who? What?
Moses' father-in-law.
Who are we talking to? Who?
That's
Jethro? Does it say Jethro?
That's another name.
It says Reuel.
Hobab.
Wait, and actually it doesn't actually say Reuel. It says that this guy in particular is known as Chovav. Wait,
But he's the son
And he's the son of Reuel. Who is this guy? It says it's his father-in-law, which we were introduced as being Jethro prior, Yitro, as well as Reuel in other places. And now he's being called Hovav, the son of himself.
Oh, so Jethro was also Reuel?
Well, it is very clear in other places that Jethro, Yitro, is Reuel. And now we have another guy, Chovav. It's a V, not a U. And apparently, since these guys were the father-in-law of Moses, Chovav is said to be the father-in-law of Moses. But of course, the difficult part here is this guy is said to be his father. Right, the father of Chovav. So Chovav is Reuel's son. Unless they have a very interesting family tree, where one person can be both his father and his own son, which I don't think works unless you have a time machine, this seems like a rather confused family tree. And indeed, it is a subject of debate and argument in the tradition. In one version of explaining this, Chovav is indeed considered to be the son of Reuel, and therefore making him Moses' brother-in-law. Which would leave us with what problem? From our text now?
Say father.
Why does it say father-in-law? Well, what it actually says in the Hebrew is choten. Now, choten usually is considered to be a father-in-law. But, at least according to some commentators, it can mean brother-in-law as well. So although the English term is unambiguous, father-in-law, the Hebrew term has at least one secondary understanding, according to some commentators, as being brother-in-law, which would make this then much neater because we get rid of that part. And now we have a conversation between Moses and Zipporah's brother. That's one explanation.
Is Choten, did you get the Machatana?
Exactly. It's the source of the Yiddish phrase, the machatana. Exactly.
Lead us to the opposition.
The-
Well,
That-
what if Zipporah only had a brother, the rest she had sisters, and then wouldn't her brother have like some sort of family authority if the father wasn't around?
And indeed, that may explain some of the comments that come later on. So, although the majority of the commentators do say, no, this is actually Jethro, this is Yitro, also known as Reuel, and the naming of Reuel as being his father is probably, like, the grandfather was also known as Reuel, and that's no problem. That, well, Reuel may actually be a title rather than a name. Reuel comes from the same root to mean to see God. And so, as being a priest of Midian, perhaps that was more of a title. The same way that earlier in Bereshit, when Avram is coming back after saving Lot, and he's met by the king of Salem, whose name is, anyone get bonus points?
King of Peace.
Melchizedek. Well, Melchizedek, the king of righteousness, which doesn't exactly sound like a personal name. No matter how optimistic a mother is, they're unlikely to name their child righteous king when they're first born. So it was probably an honorific, a title that went with his position. And Reuel maybe as well. And therefore it's very easy for Reuel to be the son of Reuel. The same way that King George can be the son of King Edward. Not that I think it goes like that, but I don't know my British kings so well. So the word king may just be passed down, and Reuel may be similar. And then we're left with, okay, we have this new name now out of nowhere of Chovav. And what does that mean? Excuse me.
We are setting out.
Up. What does that mean?
Oh, you're going.
We have, and this is of course the great temptation. The handout comes out, but I want to go through it piece by piece. Okay, so don't keep reading. Read the commentary there that's for line 29. If I could actually get someone to volunteer, it would be even better. Hearing no volunteers. Oh, thank you.
Hobab, this is Jethro, as it says, of the children of Hobab, the father-in-law of Moses, in Judges 4:11. He had many names. Jethro, because through him a portion was added
Yeter, from the same root meaning to add.
to the Torah, and Hovav, because he loved
The Torah.
Hovav,
Hovav,
the Torah.
exactly. Sorry for the way the Microsoft Word decided to print that. It's a little bit more spread out than usual Hebrew should be. So it's trying to say that each of these names has a different meaning that has to do with his character or his personality. And since we have a whole section of the Torah, a whole parasha named for him, he was named for having been given a parasha of Torah. So it's kind of a chicken and egg question, but still that's the explanation for the Yitro according to this Rashi. And then the Chovav, it has to do with him finding the Torah so dear. He loved the Torah. And that's why he was called Chovav. And other commentators say that this was the name that he chose when he attached himself to the Jewish people. That when everybody converts, or anyone converts, I should say, that they select a new name to go along with that conversion, and this was his. Make sense? Maybe? All right, let's continue the story. Back in the Tanakh, or the Chumash.
We are setting out to the place of which the Lord has said, I will give it to you. Come with us, and we will be generous with you, for the Lord has promised to be generous to you.
Okay, so the offer is, if we're talking to his father-in-law, come on, Dad, we're moving. We want you to move to the promised land, Florida with us. It's he's asking his father-in-law to move in and to stay with them. And very nice, yes? Maybe? Looking for reactions? Okay, let's check how Rashi takes this. Judy, you want to keep reading there? The second comment on the page.
We are traveling to the place. Immediately, within 3 days, we will enter the land.
He means it. We're really traveling right now. He's not, because otherwise, as a reader who knows that this is going to take 40 years, gee, thanks for the invitation. I get to come with you for what? For hanging out for 40 years? But this is trying to clarify, no, when Moses is making this offer, the expectation is we are on our way. Keep going.
For on this first journey, they traveled with the intention of entering the land of Israel, but they sinned at the episode of the murmurers.
Now, which is coming up at the next section of this parasha.
Why did Moses include himself with them?
Meaning, he's not going to enter Israel, is he?
Because the decree against him had not yet been issued, and he thought he would enter.
Right. At this point, no hitting the rock, no problems. Moses is still slated to enter the land of Israel a few days from now. So, he makes the offer in good faith. Make sense? Okay. Back to the narrative.
I will not go, he replied to him, but will return to my native land. He said,
Piece by piece. Remember, we have to unpack Torah. We can't just rush through it. This isn't like reading Harry Potter. It takes time to figure out what's going on. So Chovav, Jethro by another name, says, nope. Why not?
Back home.
What's that?
You want to go back home?
He wants to go back home. He wants to go back home. He wants to go back to his native land. What does that mean? What are some of the possibilities of what that would actually mean? Remember, anytime you're having a conversation with someone, half of what you mean isn't actually being said. And half of what they mean isn't actually being said, so you have to figure it out for yourself. So if someone says, for example, if I say, hey, do you want to come to lunch? And you say, no thanks, I gotta go home. Do you mean you don't want to come to lunch with me? And you're just finding a polite way of saying you don't want to go? Are you saying you actually have something at home you have to do? Are you saying if we go to lunch later and you can go home first, then that will be okay?
Give me a yes or
Give me a yes or a no. Well, our tradition believes that words have meaning more than just the surface, and that we are supposed to uncover those meanings. So,
Well, it could be several things. I mean, he could have hung around to make sure that his daughter was gonna really be okay with this guy.
Mhm.
And he's satisfied that she will, and so he's got responsibilities that he has to go take care of. Or it could be, I've kind of seen what this is all about, and this is more than I want to be a part of.
just because you married my daughter doesn't mean you married me.
Right.
And I'm not making.
And, you know, this Torah thing, you know, it's like more than I want.
It's a fairly substantial commitment, and going along with you may seem like I'm agreeing to it. And so maybe I'll just head home.
Well, in this, to go with him, he would be just a little frog in a big pond, where he might go back home and be the only frog in his pond.
After all, he is considered to be a priest of Midian. He is like one of the head honchos. If I stay here, I'm no longer head honcho of anything. Not only am I no longer head honcho, and you are, my son-in-law, which may rankle depending upon the psychology, but I'm not even one of the lower head honchos, the lower tier, middle management. I would be the lowest of the low on the totem pole. Maybe that's not so desirable.
So we'd still be considered a ger at this point, or no?
But he would certainly be considered a ger, someone
I
who.
mean, was he at Mount Sinai? Do we even know that? If so.
Hold on to that question of whether or not Jethro converted, and under what circumstances and motivation is going to be a big chunk of our analysis of this passage. But if he did convert, if he did join himself to the people of Israel, then he most certainly would not be anywhere near the top. He's not going to be Moses, because there's already a Moses. He's not going to be the Kohen Gadol, because he's not a Kohen at all, which means he can't even be a regular Kohen, and he can't be a Levite. He's going to be one of the rest of us. And even there, he doesn't have a tribe. So where would he pitch his tent? Which is why Rashi gives us the comment.
To my land and my birthplace, whether for the sake of my possessions or for the sake of my family.
Okay, so what Rashi's trying to point out here, that is not exactly as clear in the English translation of JPS, is that in the Hebrew it says, I'm going to my land and to my moladity, and to my birthplace. So there are two words for it, and rather than saying native land as a compound word, and Rashi is saying each one of those has a different intent. One, I'm going back to my land because there I've got land. I have an inheritance. It's territory that belongs to me, and if I go with you, what would I get? On the other hand, he may be saying, and Rashi's trying to say, unprejudiced, he may be saying, I just want to go back to my family, because that's the place of my birth. And that's where all the other people who were born there, along with me, still live, and I'd like to go back. Make sense? Which, of course, would contrast with whom? If we hear the land, the land of your birth, the land of your fathers, the land.
Yeah, Israel belongs to the Israelites.
Israel belongs to the Israelites, but who else had to make that choice between the land of their birth or going somewhere else? Abraham. So there's a definite parallel here of, it seems, Chovav choosing to do the opposite of what Abraham did, at least at this line. Abraham chose to leave the land of his birth. Chovav seems to be choosing to go back to the land of his birth. Make sense?
Well, the one phrase here where it says, come with us and we will be generous with you, the Lord has promised to be generous. That would, to me, it means land or some kind of prosperity. The land typically was prosperity.
But can Moses promise land?
That's true.
And indeed, did anyone who converted to Judaism during this time period get a tribal slice of land?
Well, yeah, and that's a question.
Well, yeah, wait. On the one hand, we would think, just basic fairness. If someone becomes Jewish during this process and they join us in our trek into Israel, that they should get some of the dirt. I mean, that was the main form of wealth that would be inherited and passed down generation to generation.
Just as she was saying that, I was struck by what the Israelites' experience had been. They were given land,
Mhm.
fields of Goshen, and look what happened to them, shortly thereafter. So, being given land, and kind of like Abraham when he wanted to buy the cave,
Mhm.
because he didn't want it to be
Any doubt.
right. I could see how that would not be so persuasive to him.
Right,
having
even if
looked
he
at what
did
happened.
say, I'll give you the back 40,
Right.
you'll give it to me, but 2 generations from now, someone else might take it away. And indeed, as we've talked about before, the land inheritance passed how? Matrilineal or patrilineal? Patrilineal. The father gives the land to the son. That was the biblical way. So if you are converting, and therefore you have no biological father who is getting the tribal allotment to give the land to you, you're out of the loop. You're out of the loop. And indeed, the formal apportionment of the land did not take into account people who had converted. The people who converted were certainly allowed to rent the land, to buy the land for up to the 50 years of the Jubilee. They could use the land, they could have all their own personal property that they could amass, but the physical land was strictly divided by the tribes. And that did mean that there was a problem for people who had converted. Make sense? Okay?
And as there will be for women in a few short chapters.
In a few short chapters, we'll also find out that there's a problem when it comes to the inheritance only being through the boys. What happens when you don't have no boys? Exactly.
Well, it's interesting, the Torah talks so much about the ger, but it doesn't really address that issue, does it?
It never explicitly addresses it, no, but it does, by implication, seem to be quite clear that the land is divided by tribe. And to be part of a tribe, your father has to be part of that tribe. And that there is a rather clear argument within later on where somebody whose mother was Jewish, but whose father was Egyptian, seems to be outside the tribal system. So tribal allotments do seem to be fairly strictly down the father-son line. And therefore the land, at least, would not be part of the inheritance that a convert would have, although they would be able to enjoy all the other blessings, but not the dirt, which was a big deal. So we're going to see a little bit more on this topic, so let's go ahead and keep moving through. So we are on now verse 31, where Moses makes the counteroffer.
He said, please do not leave us, inasmuch as you know where we should camp in the wilderness, and be our guide.
Okay, make sense? So now what's Moses saying?
Who shows the way?
We need you, it seems to be. The first sentence, the first offer was, come with us and we'll be good to you. The second offer is, come with us and you'll be good for us. So we have a different explanation now of why Moses would like Yitro to come. And at least with the Peshat, the surface reading, it makes a lot of sense. After all, Yitro knows this area. Remember, Moses stumbled into him when he was fleeing Egypt. So this is the kind of guy who knows where the wells are and where good pastures are and where the campsites are. It would make good sense to have this guy with you. But there's one problem with that interpretation. How long does Moses think it's going to take him to get to Israel at this point? Yeah, 3 days. It's like, yeah, we need a guide when all we have to do is keep walking that way. And indeed, some commentators say, not in this particular Rashi, but other commentators say, that this was Moses trying to be considerate to Jethro and trying to spare his feelings, that trying to make him feel that he was still useful to them. Even though they were going to have, as we already read, a cloud showing them where to go and where to camp, that if he could make Jethro feel worthwhile for the people, that he would keep his dignity, basically. This is a very interesting text that's often used when discussing dignity for the elderly. That Moses went out of his way, possibly even bending the truth a little bit of what was needed in order to make Jethro feel that he was contributing to the endeavor. and was willing to go that extra mile to make that happen. But Rashi takes a slightly different view. Judy, you want to keep playing Rashi?
Please don't leave us. The word na is an expression denoting a request. He made this request as he didn't want people to say, Jethro did not convert out of commitment. Rather, he thought that proselytes have a portion in the land. Now that he realizes they have no portion, he has forsaken them and gone his own way.
Okay. Explanations, interpretations, reactions? We need to unpack that a little bit more?
It sounds like Moses is more concerned about how this will look to the outside world.
Yeah. Can you talk about bad PR? It's like he was all excited. Yay, God. Yay, Israelites. What do you mean I don't get any land? Oh, well, fine. Forget you.
Yeah.
Well, that's going to look pretty bad, isn't it? And so Moses wants to make sure that Jethro comes with them so that people won't think that Jethro converted. And here, at least in Sifrei, the section of Midrash this is taken from, the idea is that Jethro did convert at Sinai, that he didn't convert for basically ulterior motives, that he wasn't converting just to get land. And when he found out he wasn't going to get any land, he left. But instead, by him coming and still not getting any land, that will prove to everyone that he converted for love of Torah, for chovav, that his name was indeed true, that he wasn't just converting for an ulterior motive.
This just sounds like Moses using the same sort of logic that he used with God. You know, why would you destroy the people? Then everybody will say you took us out of Egypt just so you could destroy us.
Exactly.
It's
worried about reputation.
Yeah.
Or is he? Because after all, who's going to know? And with Jethro having perfectly legitimate reasons for returning to his native land, it would not be that obvious as a problem. On the other hand, this may be another way that Moses is trying to convince him to stay for the sake of convincing him to stay. Of saying, don't leave, it'll look bad. Even if it won't really look bad, it gives him another opportunity to try and encourage Jethro to stay with them. Does that make sense? You know, it may not be that he's really worried about it, but if he can make Jethro think he's worried about it, then Jethro might stay.
So does he really love the Torah? I mean, if he doesn't want to stay, and
If he doesn't want to stay, and if he's got to be begged to stay,
makes me wonder.
so did he?
Where did that name come from?
Did he deserve that name, Chovav, or did he convert as the next few commentators say, or next few commentaries from Rashi say that he saw all the miracles, he saw all the wonders, and it was wow, bang, flash. But when push comes to shove, I got another life, and I got to be getting back to it. It's been fun, guys. I got caught up in the moment. But, what happens in Sinai stays in Sinai. I've got to get home. I've got to go to wife and other kids. And I got to go back. Is that what it seems to be the implication? I guess it would kind of depend upon whether or not we thought Jethro stays with them or not. And we have to read a bit more before we can answer that question.
Going to 31.
32.
32.
Yes.
So if you come with us, we will tend to you the same bounty that the Lord grants us.
Okay. And that means, according to Rashi, at the bottom on line 32's comment,
Then we will bestow on you the good. What good did they actually bestow upon him? They said, when Israel apportioned the land, there was a fertile area of Jericho measuring 500 by 500 cubits, and they refrained from allocating it. They said, the one in whose portion the temple will be built shall take it. Meanwhile, they gave it to the descendants of Jethro, to Jonadab, son of Rahab, as it says, the sons of Cani, Moses' father-in-law, went up from the city of Daves, namely Jericho.
Okay, we follow that logic? Okay. In order to follow that logic, we're going to need to do a little bit of an explanation of the problem that there are two problems being solved with this midrash. The first is a very, very simple legal problem. Israel, right?
Okay.
All the tribes are going to get a piece of land. Yes, you might have here, you might have here. I'm afraid I don't have memorized all of the tribal breakdowns. Each tribe gets a chunk. Now at the moment, where do we worship God? Where do we perform sacrifices?
Wherever the Mishkan is.
Wherever the Mishkan is. We've got our little tent, all right? And wherever you put it, that's the temporary home where we do our sacrifices, and then we pick it up and move it around. And indeed, during the first few hundred years, during the periods of Joshua and the Judges, the Mishkan moves quite a few times and gets pitched in different areas within the tribes. So no one tribe permanently loses some of their land for the national shrine. Does that make sense? This is a state versus federal thing here. When the temple gets built, though, which, according to this midrash, the Israelites know is eventually going to happen. We can always argue another time about whether or not they ever knew a temple was going to be built or whether it was an idea out of the blue. At this point, the midrash is assuming that there was always a plan for a temple, which is going to be much, much bigger than the tiny little Mishkan. You know, it's going to be 500. This pen is dying. 500 by 500 cubits, which is basically 750 feet by 750 feet. And that's a considerable chunk of arable land, potentially. You know, depending upon where it gets placed, that could be a rather large pasture or a rather large farm that's now being taken out of service from the land the tribe was supposed to get by divine apportionment. So how did they solve the problem, according to this midrash?
Says this particular chunk was essentially loaned to Jethro and his descendants until such time as the temple gets built there.
So they took an equal-sized chunk down near Jericho and set that aside as a national reserve that would be, in the temporary time, reserved for Jethro and his descendants. But a few hundred years later, it would be swapped with the ownership of whichever tribe lost itself, the slice of land that the temple would be built on. Does that make sense? We see how we're doing a sort of swap of land here to make sure that no one gets shortchanged? Maybe? So what do we think?
Yeah, it just seems a little odd about one little chunk by Jericho belonging to who knows which tribe later on, non-contiguous land.
Well, non-contiguous but desirable. The Jordan Valley Plains are quite nice. We know that Lot thought that area was a nice place to settle when he was being given the choice of any part of Israel. We know that Jericho itself was considered to be one of the mightiest cities of the Canaanites. So it's definitely a nice piece of land. It's not like you're offering them nothing. So even though it's not contiguous, at least no one can doubt the value of the dirt. They would be at least happy with what they got, because almost certainly this 500 by 500 amot cubits chunk of land is going to be more valuable than whichever land is taken for the temple. It's hard to get more expensive land. It's like offering someone a quarter square mile in the middle of New York. No matter what other chunk of land in the country you're picking from, most likely the chunk of land in New York is going to be worth more than the chunk of land just about anywhere else in this country. So everyone would be happy with the deal, even if it were, as you say, non-contiguous. Although, thankfully, it worked out to be contiguous, so no one had to worry about that in the end.
Where did Canaan come from?
Oh, good. Another name for Jethro. Indeed, Jethro is considered to have 7 names throughout Jewish tradition. He's a well-named guy. And this section here, talking about the children of Kenai, or Keni are considered to be the descendants of Jethro, and that they therefore did settle among the Israelites. And they get mentioned here, they get mentioned again later during the story of Deborah, the Yael, the woman who kills Sisera with the stake through the head, is considered to be one of these people. Although at that time there was at least a presumed alliance between them and the Canaanites, but they still seem to have been connected to Israel nonetheless. How are we doing? Confusing. Yeah, a lot of names. It's like a soap opera sometimes. So, based upon this line of Midrash, we have an understanding then that Jethro did convert, and that he did come. There are some that argue that he went back to Midian, finished converting all the rest of his people, and then came and caught up with the group, rather than stayed and went along with them. There are others who say, no, he stayed and went along with them, no problem, and then, summoned the rest of his people to join his family. But there seems to be a general agreement that, yes, in the end, he did convert and did stick with us.
Did Moses, did Zipporah have any influence on Moses? Is she at home saying, "You gotta get my dad"? I'm not going.
I'm not going anywhere without my dad. I want to, in this new house that we get, I want a guest room so that my dad can live with us.
Yeah.
Do we have any explicit statements in the Torah of that? Of course not. Do we have the right to imagine that Zipporah would want her father to come and stay with them? Of course. Does that change her understanding then of Jethro? We'll pick one name to work with for the moment. If we said, well, he only converted to stay with his daughter, would that make his conversion suspect? When we say he only converted now because Moses upped the ante, you're going to get this parcel of land, at least for the next while, even if it's not a permanent inheritance. Does that somehow diminish his connection, commitment, being deserved to be called chovav? Well, let's take a look at the alternative. That is to say, let's take a look at what other people do in their reaction to Torah, and then maybe we can juxtapose and compare Jethro to them. So let's finish off our chapter here in the Torah. It's a very interesting, and we're going to see very familiar piece.
They marched from the mountain of the Lord a distance of 3 days. The ark of the covenant of the Lord traveled in front of them on that 3 days' journey to seek out a resting place for them. And the Lord's cloud kept above them by day as they moved on from camp. When the ark was to set out.
Before we continue, I just want to get a little taste there. If you look over in the Hebrew on the right, you're going to see something a little unusual. Anyone here got sharp eyes to notice that? The upside down backward nun at the beginning and at the end of this passage. Does everyone see that? It looks like a little like a bracket. It's got an asterisk with it, which does not appear in the actual Torah, but those nuns do. When you're actually reading the Torah, those nuns, upside down and backwards as they are, appear on the scroll. What?
Because
What?
why don't they put this in English? It drives me crazy.
Oh.
But
The footnotes.
Yeah, they don't put the footnotes in English because of unfortunate arrogance of scholars, which is if you need to know, then you should know Hebrew, which I disagree with completely and consider to be a horribly wrong-headed approach. That if you want to know, I should make it available to you, but such is life. They didn't ask me to be on the committee for the composition of the editing. Well, let's go ahead and first of all see what's inside these brackets. And then we'll look at an explanation from the Talmud of where these brackets come from. And I promise we'll end up tying this back to Jethro.
And the ark
Oh, you want us to
was
sing
to
the
set out and say, "Advance, O Lord, may your enemies be scattered, and may your foes flee before you. And when it halted, he would say, Return, O Lord, you who are Israel's myriads of thousands.
Okay, sound familiar? So where do we find this section in our more daily life or regular life? In the Torah service. And we actually find both parts in the Torah service. The section that begins, Vayehi binso Aharon, Vayomer Moshe, is right up there at the beginning of the Torah service. And that's the section we just read when the ark was to set out, right? What's that? This section? Absolutely. Although you actually would have to chant it to the trope, not sing it to the melody. Sorry. Have the hardest time with those passages that people already know and then they suddenly have to read them in Torah. I've had students that are lucky enough to get the Beha'alotcha as one of their aliyot, which you suddenly realize that it's been so memorized with skewed trope that trying to chant it with the precise trope is quite challenging.
Yeah, but we have people that are reading Torah that, is not really true to form as far as trope is concerned.
Well, there are some that are still working and improving their trope. There are some that have very different trope systems that do not sound especially like many Ashkenazic systems. Many of the Sephardic systems have a much simpler trope pattern that almost sounds like no chanting at all. But it is an actual trope pattern. So it can be a challenge sometimes to Ashkenazic ears to hear such different systems. And then, like I said, there are some that are still developing their precision and getting better and better, but yes, not quite perfect yet. Okay, and then of course the last part, Uvnucho Yomar, which we know from the end of the Torah service. Or if we didn't know that already, when you are here for a Torah service, you'll be able to flip to that last page right before we get to the sermon, and you'll hear those words chanted. Okay, so why are these set out? Why is this passage set apart by these brackets so uniquely? Well, let's take a look at a little bit of Talmud and see why. Anyone want to volunteer? We're on the and when it came to pass section on the back page. Edie, you look like you're eager to volunteer, lest no one else.
And it came to pass when the ark set forward that Moses said, For this passage, the Holy One, blessed be He, provided markers beginning and end, setting it off from its context, to say that this is not its correct location.
What? Wait. So this is like God highlighted this to say, oh wait, move that later. And he hit print before he did? That this is not...
That's what that sounds like.
What's that? Isn't that what that sounds like? That this is not the right place for it? God just deliberately dropped these passages out of context? And he put markers around that so we would know? Why not just move it to the right place?
Yeah, be easy.
Okay, well, let's keep going and maybe we'll come back to why it means that.
Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi says, this is not the correct reason, but it is because it constitutes a book on its own terms, in accord with whom is that which Rabbi Samuel Bar Nachmani said to Rabbi Yonatan, said, wisdom has hewn out her 7 pillars. This refers to the 7 scrolls of the Torah.
7?
Yeah, didn't you know?
I can think of 5. This would make 6. Where's the other one?
No. Hold on a second. This is one of those IQ puzzles. If I have, I'm going to run out of room, 5 objects, and I slice one so that I now have it as a separate object, how many total objects do I have?
So we cut it into 3 pieces.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Because the piece before is now a separate book, and the piece after is a separate book, and the piece itself is a separate book. There's our 7 books of Torah. And for my next magic trick, I bet you didn't know we had 7 books of Torah. So this is a very unusual statement, to say the least. And we're not going to dwell on it too much. The import of this in the context might be having to do with how much of it would need to be written in order to be saved from a fire. That's the context that this is all being discussed in Shabbat. There's a fire burning and the books are on fire. Which books are you allowed to save? Which books are you not? And a book of Torah you're allowed to save. But exactly what constitutes the book of Torah? Does just one word of Torah constitute a book of Torah? Does it have to be the whole Torah to constitute the book of Torah? And the argument goes on. We're not going to look into it. This opinion would be saying, even this little section here with the nuns on either side would be a book of Torah, and therefore worthy of being saved. Does that make sense? Getting a lot of puzzled looks. Give that a chance to sink in. So you wouldn't run into a burning building to save, Herman Melville's, Moby Dick. But if this little section were on a piece of parchment and the flames were licking ever closer, grab it and run. Make sense? Okay, that's an opinion. I'm not trying to say that's the definitive opinion. That is an opinion, but it's not the main one we're going to be focused on. The main one we're going to be focusing on is the one that we were just told wasn't the correct one, which we're going to go back and try and save. Okay, and the idea that this is just a piece of Torah that has been moved from another location. And it's not a whole separate book. Let's see if we can justify that. Edie, that's your job. Justify it.
Rabban Simeon Gamaliel says, this passage is destined to be uprooted from the present location and to be written in its correct spot. And how come it was written here? It is to establish a partition between the first passage that deals with punishment and the second. What is the second? And the people were as murmurers.
If you flick your eyes over to chapter 11, we're not going to read through it. It's depressing anyway. We end up with all of them murmuring against God and a fire breaking out against them. And then we end up with a whole story about the quail. The people wanting meat and remembering Egypt, and they get so much quail fed to them that it's coming out their nostrils. So the next chapter is all depressing, horrible, punishing, nasty stuff. And according to Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, this piece was taken from another spot and put here to make a break between punishments and more punishments. Good. Seeing some nice blank expressions. Because what's wrong with that?
Why do we need to divide them?
Well, why do we need to divide punishments? Well, like us, the rabbis didn't want to have too much depressing stuff continually being read. But they're saying very clearly, the next verse after this is about the people who are complaining against God and the fire that breaks out against them. Which means that if this pen works, if this nun section, and just do it like that, if this nun section has punishment and devastation on this side, immediately following it, what are we expecting over there?
Punishment.
Another punishment. It says it's trying to divide punishments. So where's the punishment that this is setting apart?
It can't be just that they're leaving Mount Sinai. That doesn't make any sense.
Can't it? Let's see.
Punishment, leaving Sinai?
Let's see. So first of all, just
We're going to the promised land.
Just a second. So Rabban Gamliel goes on to say, or actually Rav Chama bar Rav Chanina says that the place should have been written way back where we started, which is that piece where they're actually saying they're moving away from Mount Sinai and all the flags are waving in the wind and such. That's where it should have been, because that's when the ark got up and started moving. So why tell it to us here? Because it's trying to divide off these punishments, one from the other. But then we have to say, where was the punishment? Where was the sin that happened prior to this separation? I mean, if they put it between the murmurers and the quail, that would be perfect. Because there's one nasty bit of people and a punishment, and another nasty bit of people and a punishment. But it ain't there. It's before that series of two punishments happen. So, we're left with our next to last paragraph on the handout. Edie, you want to carry on? It's Ramban, it's not Talmud, but he's still good. It's okay.
They left.
Yes.
They left Mount Sinai with joy, like a child who runs away after school. They said, perhaps he will give us more commandments if we stay. Though no punishment is listed for this sin, perhaps it would not have taken 3 days to reach Israel had they not acted like this.
Okay, so despite your incredulity, Judy, that how could leaving Mount Sinai be a sin, since that's what they were supposed to do and they were heading towards Israel, there's a difference between the emotion of heading towards Israel and running away from Mount Sinai, which is what Ramban and numerous other commentators are pinning as being the transgression and the possible punishment. And that metaphor, which again shows that children haven't changed for much in the last 2,000 years, of running away from school like children, of, woo, we're done, day's over, we can get out of here before they give us more homework, is not exactly the attitude that we would want, is it? Well, what would we hope would be the attitude?
And also the idea that living Torah for itself versus getting this reward of land in the other, in Israel.
Exactly. The people should have said, oh man, we have to leave Sinai where we got to hear God, and this is this amazing thing, and we've gotten so much from God. If we stay, maybe we'll have more that we can do. But if we have to go to Israel, that's what God commands, then we'll do it. That would have been the attitude that the sages would have liked to have seen. Not, woo, school's out, let's go, head to the playground.
Is there any other place in Torah that you have this set apart text?
No. But yeah, the nuns don't happen like that. Which leaves us then with the question that I promised I'd get back to. How can we compare them to Chovav, to Jethro? Because then if we read Rambam's commentary and the idea that this is setting apart one problem from another, then they are having a certain attitude towards Torah, and he potentially is having a certain attitude towards Torah. And they are now being juxtaposed quite deliberately if we read the Midrash as explaining how the Torah came to be arranged in this particular and peculiar fashion. So then how would we compare them? Or would you like to know a little bit more about how the rabbis view Jethro? All right, last paragraph. Edie?
Okay. 3 participated in that conspiracy to destroy the Israelites in the river: Balaam, Job, and Jethro.
All right, so a very, very interesting midrash here, saying that when Pharaoh was trying to decide what to do with the Israelites, that he got these guys involved, and he wanted them to be on the committee of the solution to the Jewish problem, or Israelite problem as it was at the time. And so Balaam, Job, and Jethro are sitting at a conference table with Pharaoh. Carry on.
Who gave the advice was slain.
So Balaam, who said, you know what you should do? Chuck some of them in the river. Balaam gets the axe.
Job, who kept silence, was judged through suffering.
Job didn't say, do it, and he didn't say, don't do it. He just sat at the table and played with his phone. He didn't participate in this committee meeting. He just was there. And for being silent in the face of the evil, he was therefore punished with all that befell him. Which is a wonderful counterpoint to the book of Job, which seems deliberately set up to try and indicate that he had never done anything wrong. But we don't necessarily have to make every midrash match every other midrash. Let's leave it with the in and of itself for today.
Jethro, who fled, had the merit that some of his sons'
Meaning descendants.
would go into session as judges in the hewn stone chamber, Sanhedrin.
Okay, but Jethro, who said, I want no part of this, and bolted. What ended up with him? That his descendants would ultimately become judges in the Sanhedrin. That his children would become allied with Israel and rise to prominence in the community.
So then this midrash says that he doesn't stay.
This midrash says he doesn't stay with Pharaoh. When Pharaoh makes the
only
decision,
from Pharaoh.
he fled from Pharaoh,
Okay.
but he fled to Torah. As opposed to the midrash about the Israelites, which has them fleeing from Torah. And our whole concern about Jethro of what would be his motivation, or whether he would stay or whether he would go, and what reward he might receive. Well, apparently the land, even if that was a reward, was a very time-limited benefit. But ultimately, the greatest reward the rabbis could imagine was bestowed upon his children, or his descendants. And it's the reward that can be bestowed upon anyone, no matter whether they were born Kohen, Levi, Israelite, or non-Jew. Once you're a Jew, everyone has access to learning, to Torah. And being the ultimate learners and the ultimate sage is what gets you on the Sanhedrin. Not your position, your status, your economic wealth, your ability to manipulate the system. It's your learning. And that is available to everyone.
Which sounds like just the perfect line from the rabbis who wanted
Of
to
course,
make that point.
of course, of course. It was exactly the perfect line from the rabbis. But that was the society they were trying to create. They were trying to create a society where privilege did not give you power. It gave you privileges, but it didn't give you power over others. And that where family birth did not give you power over others. And they saw in Jethro someone who chose to give up power and family and all that he had in Midian, and eventually at least seems to have been brought into the fold of the Israelites. And they wanted to say, and that was rewarded, that was something that was eventually to his credit.
So we don't have anything definitive whether he stayed or not stayed in Torah. We just, they're
Oh,
assuming he did.
If it was definitive, we wouldn't have nearly as much time to discuss.
Okay, all right,
Yes.
so this is.
You know, we definitively know that Abraham left Ur.
Yeah.
Here, the Torah does not make it clear. We are left to trying to analyze that and to understand it. But as a reflection of the intent of the sages, of what they believed to see in the story, and what they believed to see in the contrast between those who were fleeing Torah and those who were running to Torah, is a very powerful message. And with that, we'll call it a day and hope to see everyone again next week. Just a reminder that we're on every Wednesday through the end of June, but in July we'll be on hiatus. Okay, take care. Just through July. We'll pick it back up again in August.